Hi, this is Justin Spring, and I have to do something here. Getting a little echo. I think we got rid of it that time. I'm going to talk a bit about stories um, in in this section. It sounds as though stories would be so simple. Why even bother to you talk about it? People tell stories all day long, and there's gossip and there's funny stories and things like that. But I'm going to go into it because there are some stories that are called poetry. And they have slightly different characteristics than the stories we call funny, or the stories we call gossip, or the stories we call history, or the stories we call science, like E equals MC squared. It's a very short story. It doesn't have a lot of emotion to it, but it has the ending clarity of a logical deduction. On your deathbed, it's not much use to you, but when you're living, you can get pretty excited about it, especially if you're making bombs. But those stories are all different in one respect from the story that we call poetry. And one of those stories is playing in back of me here in an audio-visual form. It's a video poem. You can think of it that way, or it's like a fugue with both visual and spoken elements, and there are some written elements as well. But it's an audio-video version of the Witness's Log, which is a story about the creation of our first consciousness, and it's a poem. So and it was created independently of the written versions and the oral versions. This is an audio-visual version, which is different. It combines a leitmotif of visuals along with the spoken version of the Witness's Log, and then some additional things that I added in terms of written words. What makes a story a poem is that it's metaphoric and it's rhythmic. You can detect the rhythm to it. That's not our ordinary rhythmic speech, which is mostly iambic in form, but has its own particular rhythm. That the rhythm of a poem is slightly accentuated from that, and usually in the iambic when you speak, although it might vary from that quite a bit because it is a spoken poem, but you can detect the rhythm, and it's metaphoric. It speaks in metaphors. And it's a story that always ends in an ecstatic moment of beauty and truth. An ecstatic moment of beauty and truth. And it's a story that comes unbidden from the unconscious. No other stories come unbidden from the unconscious except if they're prayer, spontaneous prayer, not a prayer from a book. And none, even prayer, fails to end in an authentic, ecstatic moment, an orgiastic moment, you could call it, of beauty and truth. So it has some very special characteristics, the story called poetry. And some might argue with my definition of poetry as being a story, but it is a story. We can bend it and get imagistic, and we can kind of break the story up into little stories, like Pounded and the rest of it. You can do all that stuff afterwards, but the way the story comes to us is primarily always, not even primarily, but as a narrative, because that's the way the unconscious works. Anything non-narrative is added later by the poet, breaking up the story. Even the unconscious in its solo form, when it doesn't meet the conscious mind, is when we sleep and we dream and we have a memory which we try to put together that memory then in a way that we can relay it to others. It always attempts a story, but it can't quite get the space and time right, because it lives in a realm of unspace and untime. So there are some dreams which we'll never be able to explain. We'll just say it was wonderful. And there are some visions we can have that are so electrifying and so beautiful that to try to relay them, as we can see in some of the visions of the Bible, they don't seem to make any sense. People are always saying, well, it's spaceships from outer space. But really what the prophet was trying to do is trying to explain what he experienced. And sometimes it's beyond explanation in space and time. You just do the best you can, and you say it was a moment in which I was transported to another dimension. It was wonderful. Here's the best I could do. So we can forget those moments for a second, those moments of vision in which the storytelling ability of the conscious mind fails. And we can forget our dreams somewhat because they don't really exist in a world of space and time. We kind of put them in that as best we can when we try to relay it, but they change. You know, I have dreams where I'm somebody, then I'm somebody, then I'm a frog, and I'm in a railroad station, then next thing I'm standing next to my mother. That doesn't have... It's a dream composed of a feeling narrative, which is related in some very strange way to each other, the images, but it's when you try to tell people about it, they kind of get lost sometimes, you know, unless it's a very straightforward dream, which can sometimes happen. They can be translated very easily into direct stories. One of the things that people fail to appreciate is that stories are the miracle of being human. We sometimes dismiss them. Well, logic is and reason is, and we can make tools and we can make the atom bomb, and mathematics is the reason, and philosophy, and the Greeks kind of fell into that a little bit as they began to get more and more illiterate. You can see that in Aristotle. I don't know if Plato quite swallowed that as whole as Aristotle did. He was a mystical person, and he was a storyteller for sure. In fact, I can think of all of his works as essentially not philosophy but stories, which tried to make the point that it's difficult to explain anything. And I'm talking about the Republic as well as the Socratic dialogues. You can attempt to explain the world, but when you do, here's the result that you get. You get a king in charge of a republic, and he's going to assign everybody to a specific job. Everybody knows that's a recipe for disaster, and Plato knew it too, but when you follow his philosophy down to its finest points, that's what you wind up with, you know. Everybody should be doing what they should be doing according to their essential character or souls. It doesn't work out that way in reality. That's called being human. And of course, the Socratic dialogues, or he just used, you know, Socrates, the gadfly that he was. If you read I.F. Stone's story about Socrates, he was a ball buster, you know, and you could bust balls in any culture and you could get your ass kicked, and that's when he got his ass kicked. But Plato took Socrates and he used him to confuse all of the clear thinkers of his day. So you can't say what love is or what beauty is. What you really have to go back to in the end is a ideal form, he called it, of beauty. And it's from that we know beauty, and nobody can really define it. And that's at the central point of all of his philosophies. We're going to come back to that in a second, because that archetypal form, as Jung called it, an ideal form, as Plato called it, there's also an ideal form, to my mind, it's called poetry. That is, it's the thing that allows us to know poetry and the thing that allows us to create poetry, because it comes from beyond our conscious selves. You know, you can consciously create a poem, but it never closes correctly. Many poets do that today, are wonderful writers, and can fool you until you get to where the poem closes, and it never closes correctly. It never brings you to that ecstatic moment of beauty and truth. It might bring you to beauty or maybe a truth, but it never brings you to that out of your mind, heaven blazing into the head, ecstatic moment. It might have even the rhythm and the metaphorical structure, but it doesn't come unbidden. Unfortunately, it comes bidden by the conscious mind. And let me talk a little bit about stories in general. You know, what are stories? I kind of puzzled about that for a long time, because central to the myth that's playing in the back, in terms of the mythic poem, is that it identifies humans, the first humans, or the first way to look at humans, or the essential character of the first humans, as witnesses. And I had a hard time in trying to get down to what that meant. I knew it wasn't being a witness in a jury and all the rest of that stuff, or a witness in a Baptist church. Well, they're somewhat related. It had to do with something else. And I asked Jane Washington, who is a poet and an intuitive, one night, I said, you know, what is this thing that the myth is talking about when it says you witness? You know, I get all these explanations, and then something's going around in my head, but I don't quite get it. She looked at me for a while, and she was like that, very sharp, you know. She came back, she goes, observe and report. That's what it means. Observe and report. And I asked her, well, what do you mean observe what? She said, what's in the present? So what do you mean in the present? So what's in your mind and what's outside your mind at that moment. That's what you witness. You observe that and you report it. And that's what witnessing is. It was a mouthful. But in fact, she was correct. The more I thought about it, that stories are, that to witness, to create stories is to observe something and report it to someone else. If there was no one else in the universe, no gods, no other humans, only one human was ever created, the first human might try to tell stories but would soon give up because there would be no recognition that a story had been told. Because if there were no gods to understand it, or if there was, of course the animals don't understand it at all they can do is express present moment feelings. They can say things like bird and hungry, but they can't go beyond that. And what a story is, it's an observation of something in your mind or something in the external world, and which something within us, which we'll call the storyteller, creates a little world. And the object of that little world is to pass an emotion from me to you, or from me to whoever I'm talking to. Otherwise, there's no reason for the story. Just go to a cocktail party and start talking to someone and have them turn away from you. Look at a beautiful girl and your mouth just drops. Stories are communications of feelings, very complex feelings, that simple words won't do, or mime won't do, or whatever won't do, and you eventually have to create a little world that says, this is how I feel. And then the other person takes it in. Most of our stories are just feelings of, this is how I feel about how the grocer treated me. You know, whatever he happened to be, how he put his thumb on the scale and he over-cheated you, or about your neighbors as dirty kids, or whatever it happens to be. And it goes on and on. The stories of mathematics, the stories of this, the stories of gossip, the stories of human. This was funny. I saw it. I want you to know how funny it was, how I felt. I laughed. Those go on and on and on. And as a friend said to me the other day, who's a writer, he's got a new writer in a way, you know. He said, you know, what really kind of interests me, because is that stories kind of make themselves up, is that I can talk to you just here and I don't really think about what I'm doing, whereas when I write I have to think. So, well, that's a problem. In fact, you should be telling more stories, you know. But even more to the point is that stories are what make us human, that we can't stop telling stories, and it's so much of us, it's like breathing, it's like our heartbeat. You don't have to know what we're saying. I haven't thought a thing about what I was going to say today. I just got up and I started to talk to you out there. Whether there's one of you or 5,000 people listening to me, I'm just addressing who was ever listening. And I suppose there is a listener there. Otherwise, I couldn't tell the story. So it's a way of expressing very, very complex emotions until you get to the stories of Shakespeare and Homer and Cervantes and Dickens, where you create a world that's so rich in emotion and so rich in feeling. It says, here is a world that is tragic in its conception and the way that it unfolds and the way that you fit into it. And there's something so beautiful and so true about it that even though the story may be tragic and dark, we achieve that ecstatic moment of beauty and truth. Not so much in prose, although it can happen slightly, but I take, in terms of the early Dickens, and I take, of course, Shakespeare and Homer as poets, is there you get the full chance for the poem to unfold itself, since both were essentially unconscious artists. They never looked back. I don't think they had a thought in their head. There's an interesting book by a critic, David Steiner, who went back to look at all of the writers and said it central to their thinking and their art was an idea. And he went through all of them. I guess you can say that about the later Dickens, since he had ideas about modern industrial England, you know. But in the early Dickens, he was pretty much on a roll, like a poet is. I can't see him having a thought in his head. He was so. And the same with Cervantes, in a way. You know, I don't think he really thought much about the reality and the illusion he was creating. It just came out of him. And for sure, it didn't come out of Shakespeare. He said of Shakespeare, Shakespeare is the one exception. Shakespeare has no ideas. It's perfect. That's what we want. We want no ideas. Ideas belong in philosophy. Maybe they belong in novels, but I don't think so. A certain kind of novel. philosophical novel, that kind of stuff. It just, you know, here's my ideas, but I'm going to disguise them as a hero and a heroine. I'm going to let them work it out, and you get the idea. Here's the idea. You just kind of tell them the idea. But people like to do that, and some people like to be fed that, so that's the way it is. But the story forms itself automatically, and the story is a result of something that takes place in the human mind, which is constantly observing and reporting. Now let's just forget for a second about that. In our modern mind, we can report to ourselves as we can create a listening self. You know, that I talk to them all the time, you know, trying to convince them, but I don't know, sometimes I get there and sometimes I don't. But let's just think about that we have somebody that we want to relay something to them. And I take two people. I take myself to walk down a street, and I tell myself to make up a story to tell to Joe Blow. And I have a thief walk down the same street, and I ask him to tell a story afterwards to explain his walk on the street. And in my story, when I come back, let's say that I walk down the street, and I remember the street because it was in Los Angeles and Santa Monica. I walked down the street. All of the lawns were green and trimmed. It was beautiful, the dark from the Pacific coolness. And there was one house I particularly liked. It was white, clapboard house, an old kind of old-fashioned style, wooden house, and it had the most beautiful roses on trellises that were climbing around the door, and the door was the darkest, most resilient green I've ever seen. It just kind of pulled me in. It was unbelievable. And my walk was just pretty much my seeing that house and my thinking about how beautiful it was. And then we get the thief, because I'm going to be a thief. Now, when I walked down the street, and the one house I liked was a house that had a lot of hedges around it, so you couldn't see inside. And I saw that all the windows were half open, and they were low to the ground, so you could crawl in. And an old car in the driveway, and it probably meant an old person living there, you know. So I could break into that house real easy, and I could just, you know, thunk them on the head. Whoever's in there, an old lady or an old guy, you know, nobody would see me from the street, and that's what I liked about my walk. What's the difference between the two walks? The walk is the same, but what drives the observation automatically is your essential character, always, unless you're given an assignment to observe any house over 3 stories high that's painted pink. Well, let's say your normal thing, where you're walking and you don't have any thoughts in your mind, and you walk, and then you say, well, you know, what I saw was a white house, and then the other guy sees the low hedges. What was different was our interest, and our interest is the thing that guides all of our observations. If not, our mind would be flooded. To observe the world is to observe a multiplicity beyond description. At some stage, we cut off just about everything except what interests us. And that interest is automatically accumulating things. We don't really think about it until somebody asks us, and you say, oh, yeah, well, yeah, I walked down that street, and here's what I remember seeing. So it always selects things. The mind is selective. It observes what is commensurate with the character, unless given an assignment. And that's why the thief's view of the street was much different than my own. So there's an interest that drives stories, and that same interest is used to, since those observations are not put in like a movie with 24 frames, with 29.97 frames per second of the street, that just what interests you is put there like a spider web with little nodules being the green door and the white and the house and the roses. And somehow when we go back, this is the miracle of storytelling memory, which is different than verbatim memory. Storytelling memory we use every day, but we don't realize it, just as though we don't observe. We don't really remember that we're observing and reporting selectively. And what happens is, as soon as we tell a story, it becomes a part of our memory. It lays on top another neural net, if you think of it, that go back ad infinitum, right back to our first day that we come into the world, and a lot of time before that, if we understand Jung in terms of our collective memories, you know. So what we have is a kind of neural network that reassembles itself when we tell a story. It's a miracle. And how we tell that story is going to be dependent on our interest at that time. For example, if I'm St. Paul and I'm looking at the landscape around me prior to my conversion, which was an extraordinary conversion, is that my attitude towards the world, my interest in the world changed almost 180 degrees. From one in which all Christians were evil and to be persecuted and killed, to one in which I clearly saw that Christianity was the savior of the world. And I became a proselytizer. Those two mindsets, the interest changed. Your interest can change over time. And what I would say is that the interest, which is his most essential character that he had before conversion, was one that he had acquired. And that's one of the things. We come into the world with an essential character. Character is fate, as the Greeks say. It determines what we will do in life. And then we lay on top of it what our parents tell us and our teachers tell us and the culture tells us, and can often almost smother what is underneath, which is the essential character. And for St. Paul, it was a proselytizer, but he was proselytizing the wrong thing. And it was an openness to newness. It was, the Christ ideas of love thy neighbor was so utterly opposed to the religious and spiritual ideas of the Jews and the Romans of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that it would take something which we can't explain, some kind of change in the soul, or some unbearing of the soul, a transformation of the soul, or maybe the soul finally seeing things clearly and just dropping all the accretions that it had and seeing that love thy neighbor, charity is the key to living. So if we to go through that conversion, and if St. Paul were to tell a story of the people he saw in the streets, the Christians, before and after, it would be completely different. The things he would see and the way he would tell a story would be completely different. It might even be difficult for him to tell the old stories, because the string that's going to go back to the neural net and collect them and to form them into new stories again, which again going to become memories, doesn't quite find what it wants to find. You know what I mean? Which is why it's so hard to sometimes recreate dreams as stories, besides the space-time problem, is that there was an interest inside us that was creating the dreams. We don't know what that interest is. It may be ours, but it may be completely different. What happens in dreams is really... People tell you that they understand dreams. Forget it. You know, that exists in a world that we don't control. So when we try to apply our waking interest, whatever it is, which is an essential character, back to dreams, we can't connect the little things that have become memories very well. It's hard sometimes. Which brings us finally to the stories we call poetry, which is I wanted to say something to you about. My experience is that the interest that forms a poem is different, or it's allied to my own character, my own soul, my own interest as a poet. And in fact, I would say it's the interest of the muse, or I would say it's the interest of the unconscious, or the interest of the collective unconscious, whatever rises up. The story it's going to tell is a story that is composed, that starts with the same kind of observation that we would in an ordinary story, something observed in the world or in our mind. That almost always happens, although that moment can be so brief before we feel the rising of the interest, which I feel burns. It burns in a good way. I can feel it rising up and seizing control of my imagination, and in terms of the storyteller. It seizes control of the storyteller. If you take the storyteller as a serpent that is winding itself around the memories and about to tell a story that another serpent entwines it, which is the interest of the muse. The muse, you could say, is the interest of the pure poet within my character, or within the poet's character, that is not bothered by all of the overlays that we've had as children and as adults as to how to feel and perceive the world. It simply bursts out of us. That's my best feeling about us. And sometimes it comes from an interest which I have no idea. The interest that formed this poem in back of me, if I can point to it here, part of it I can feel as me, and part of it came from the collective unconscious. And how I can describe that interest is simply to say it was intense, and I wanted to form that poem. I didn't understand the poem when it came to me. I just simply delivered it as true. The baby wanted to come that way, and I let it come that way. I let the words form on my lips, and out they came. And it's one of the things that was extremely puzzling to me for a long time. That never happened to me before, that I had gone that deep, because I couldn't understand why I didn't understand my own poem. And the reason was it wasn't my own poem. It was partially my own. You know, Jung makes an interesting observation that the visions from the collective unconscious always have the individual unconscious accreted around them. It's like afterbirth, you know. You can't separate the two. Almost impossible, whether it's the book of Revelations or any of the visions you see in the Old Testament. You have to go with the intent of the vision, and I had to go with the intent of the poem. So what you have is you have a rising up of interest that is pulling memories out from God knows where and forming a story that it wants to tell. It overpowers the poet. If the poem doesn't overpower the poet in his creation, you're going to have one crappy poem. It has to in some way do that. So what you have is a poem is not only a special story in that is rhythmic, it is metaphoric, that brings us to a ecstatic moment of beauty and truth. It is overpowering, but it also is invested with an interest in its creation. That is an interest that creates the story, that forms the story out of our memories and perhaps out of memories we have that are in our unconscious and that are collective, that aren't our personal memories in any way. It forms that poem and is directed by that interest in its storytelling. The poems of Homer are like that, and the great dramatic poems of Shakespeare are like that. There's no doubt about that in my mind, that neither of them had an idea in their head. They didn't have any axe to grind, no causes. They just wanted to express. They had felt the rising of the muse, and they adored the muse. And they wanted to be in that place, heaven blazing into the head. So that's a little opening for stories. If you want to know more about stories, I had to come to terms with these stories. So what is a story really, and what is different about the story we call the poetry and the story we call gossip or history or philosophy? You can take a look at this book. You just type in Alice Hickey Between Worlds into Google and you'll get it. And if you go to the appendix, there's a link to the appendix there. It doesn't cost anything to go see it. That you'll find a great deal about stories and how stories are composed and how they are created and how storytelling memory works. Not from a medical point of view. I don't have any way of knowing that, how it's done. I don't think anybody really knows. But I can give you a conceptual idea as to how it feels. And I think that's the important thing, is I can give you a conceptual structure. Whether it actually works that way out in the genes and the genomes and the DNA, God knows how it's going to work itself out. But I can tell you from a conceptual point of view, that's how it worked, and that's how it works. That's how stories are created and how poems are created. You know, poems are the way in which our unconscious and our conscious minds come together, and they're a mirror. And we can experience them as poets or ordinary people if we allow ourselves to be swept away by the poetic moment. And that's what my work has been all about. If you take a look at Soul Speak the Outward Journey, which I'm going to show you here in a second because this is the last time I'm going to talk about it. You can read that also. It's a poem can be formed. These stories we call poetry can be formed by speaking, by writing, by dancing, by mime, by singing. You simply have to surrender to the muse. And it contains techniques for actually doing that and letting it happen. You have to take your chances. It's not a holiday exercise. You have to, there is something both divine and innocent about poetry. You have to treat it as such as you go to it. It's the way that we become whole again. We become totally human. And I think that's what is lacking in today's world, that we've become slowly dehumanized and concerned only with the self and shopping and all the things that go with it. That's fine. But what we really want is to become more vibrant human beings, and to do that we have to bring the two halves of ourselves together, and the one act that does it is the act called poetry, not the intellectual writing of all that nonsense that we see in all of our quarterlies and the little kind of gimmicks and limericks. They're fine. Go ahead and do it if you want to do it. But really one is that unbidden story that comes from the unconscious, and is both rhythmic and metaphoric, and that brings us to an ecstatic moment of beauty and truth like no other. Because what is happening is the two halves of ourselves are mating, they're coming together. We're becoming more whole, more beautiful, and more true. It's the soul's road, and your poetry is the way to stay on the soul's road. I know I know you like a nice equation for it, but it's a messy business. And it takes some nerve. So I hope you gain the nerve. I'm going to give you a very small poem now. It was created, an audiovisual poem I call Dream Stories. I did it one afternoon because I was looking at my office where I'm sitting today, looking at some of the artwork in it because I like to be surrounded by it, and I was feeling particularly out in left field, as poets feel. You feel that they're born in the wrong time and space, but we can't do much about that. And as I looked at these things, I suddenly felt a poem rising up inside me, and I grabbed the computer and I played what I thought was music, but in fact it was not music. It was it was an audio recording of another audio poem I had done with my partner, Syl Liscombe. And so you'll hear her voice and my own secondary voice, coming up in the background. But the soul can easily accommodate those. It dances with many partners at once, doesn't bother it. And I simply surrendered, and out this poem came, very short. You can do it. You just have to take your chances. Sometimes when I look at myself from far, far away, I don't know who I'm looking at. It's a boy, or it's a picture, or it's something made of imagination, something shaped of wax guttered onto the table. I could live forever and not understand these words.
I don't know how it happened.
I cannot crush them with my hands or give them to you.
But it did.
They're only dust. What can I say to you?
I crossed a bridge.
You who are looking at me. What can I tell you?
And now I'm burning it.
What can you say to me? Here,
I was
in this room,
thinking of you.
on this afternoon,
I'm burning my bridges.
when nothing happens,
I can never go back.
where I look out the window and everybody is coming and going,
Look at you.
and only I have no name.
I was thinking of you.
Only
That way
I
again.
have no name at all.
I have to tell you.
I was thinking